Hello. Thank you so much for signing in today to today's conversation. I think it's going to be a very interesting one. I'm Steve Sterkowski. I'm the Vice Dean for Research at Dell Medical School at the University of Texas in Austin. And I'm really pleased today to have guests joining me to talk about a sometimes sensitive topic, but I think one that is just critically important to continue to expand on. It's gotten a lot of national press, but today we're going to focus on how systemic racism impacts mental health and mental health care. So I'm pleased to introduce my two guests. The first is Roberto Luis Fernandez. Roberto is a professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia in New York, and is also director of the New York State Center of Excellence for Cultural Competence. We're very pleased to have Roberto here today. Roberto, welcome.
Thank you.
Our second expert is Harold Neighbors. He goes by Woody, those of us who know him well. Woody is a professor emeritus at the University of Michigan and is senior scientific advisor for the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. So Woody, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
So these gentlemen I've known for years. They're both great people, and I think they're going to bring us a really interesting discussion. So gentlemen, as we look at the cultural landscape today, there's a lot of discussion about systemic racism as it infiltrates all aspects of our lives. When you think about that, how does that also impact psychiatry and mental health care? And if so, how? Roberto, would you start?
Sure. First of all, I wanted to emphasize the fact that we're talking about systemic aspects of racism, not only individual aspects. So we're talking about a whole system, a whole structure that includes policies, institutional practices, training systems, legislation, parity issues. I mean, it's all involved in the practice of psychiatry, the delivery of psychiatric care and mental health care more generally, that is done in a racist way. And also that racism is sometimes for individual practitioners can be explicit, but it can also be implicit, so that they may be even unaware of some of their practices while espousing non-racist views in principle, but may still be affected by racist practices in their daily work. Yeah. So having said that, and then I'll just say a couple more things and then hear what Woody has to say as well. But I think it's very important to recognize that in psychiatry, there are, in my view, two kinds, if you will, of systemic racism. One is a kind of a sins of commission, and others are sort of sins of omission. And the examples of the sins of commission are all around us, like in the ways in which research has found less guideline concordant care for across different racial and ethnic groups, how it takes, it's harder. Some groups are less detected when they show up with certain diagnoses across multiple studies, or are misdiagnosed. A famous example is schizophrenia among African Americans, partly because there is less time spent with certain people in doing assessments, or less attention paid to certain types of symptoms, like mood symptoms when people present with psychosis, or presentations that may be psychotic. And then I'll just give a couple examples of sins of omission and then stop. By sins of omission, I mean a general lack of attention to the issue of racism in how care is apportioned in this country, despite the fact that we've had the same findings in research studies for decades. We still have the persistence of these problems. So, for example, limited attention to language access, even though it's, in care, even though it's very clear that some people require interpretation or work in a different language to be well cared for. or the fact that we really don't pay enough attention. I mean, there are obviously exceptions, but we don't pay enough attention to social determinants of mental health and how those affect mental health presentation and outcomes and affordability of care and all this, even though we know that not only do they affect everybody, they affect different people differentially. Racial and ethnic groups are who are underserved are particularly prone to suffering from social determinants that are unaccounted for in our care. So these are just examples. I'll stop here because I could keep going on, but I don't want to. So I'll pass it on to Woody.
Well, thanks, Roberto. Woody, and to then please expand on that. And also, do you feel like that the systemic racism in mental health care is unique, or is it an extension of society and medicine more generally?
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on a number of things that Roberto said. I think he and I are very much on the same page. To answer your question, I consider the field of medicine to be firmly embedded within our larger society. Our society has been since the beginning, structured on the basis of racial hierarchies. So medicine, and then of course psychiatry as part of medicine, is no different from any other organization, system, or structure. So we should expect to see the legacy of racism within medicine, within psychiatry, and I would include my field, public health as well. The second thing I would like to elaborate upon is racism. For me, when I think about it, it is fundamentally a political ideology that was thought out and well planned to substantiate a socioeconomic structure that was designed to benefit some people at the tremendous devastation and cost to other groups. So we can't talk about racism without talking about white supremacy. And that's when, the conversation does get a little uncomfortable, because if you do believe in a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, then you are flat out racist. Now, Roberto makes a very good point that I want to, differentiate some of the terms that unfortunately often get used interchangeably as if they were synonymous, and they are not. So racism, is what I said it was. But racial discrimination, is a more, behavioral manifestation of that racist ideology. And then, of course, the one that we're all very concerned about right now is the notion of implicit bias. And I think that is the most challenging aspect of what I think about when I think about how racism is played out presently in the interactions across race and ethnicity. So my background is psychology. So at the end of the day, even though I think of systemic and organizational and structural racism as being embedded in the policies of these different organizations, because I'm a psychologist, at the end of the day, I'm still going to look for the people in positions of power who are enforcing those policies that disadvantage some groups of color. So while we are talking about systemic racism, I also think we need to talk about the interpersonal aspects of that. So I think that's my opening statement. I'll kind of stop there, but of course, there's a lot more to this story, including, if we have time, I can talk a little bit about what it has meant for me as a Black man growing up in the United States, born in the early 50s, who participated very personally in this grand experiment we called racial integration.
Great, thank you both. Just want to riff briefly off the point, but don't want to detract from my experts today. But from work we've done that you all have been part of and aware of, when practitioners who are often view themselves as open-minded, liberal-minded, fair people are often shocked that when you show them how they make diagnoses, they are race biased. And so, to your point, there's the systemic structural component that I think even the best intended people are unaware of. And then there's implicit bias that they also don't attend to. And so even people who try not to make these errors still make them.
Yeah, it's, what Roberto was, referencing is, what we either call, fast thinking or blind spots. And when I was presenting a lot on the racial diagnosis and misdiagnosis, I used to somewhat joke that I never met a culturally insensitive clinician whenever I was doing this work on misdiagnosis. And everyone was not only surprised, but outraged by what the data were showing, yet it was very difficult for any of us to step up and, sort of look in the mirror and start that deep process of introspection to figure out whether, we're falling prey to some of these preconscious, subconscious, or implicit stereotypes that, again, are embedded in us from day one because of our societal structure.
Great, thank you. So the next question I wanted, Woody and I actually are working together on a book about this, and so this is a premature plug for when it someday will come out. But as Roberto, as you hinted, this has been going on for a long time and recognized for decades. Some of us have been working for decades now, which is amazing. So how do we solve it? What are some things we could do to start addressing it, at least in psychiatry and mental health, and maybe then lead other areas of the country?
Well, that's a very good question. And I wanted to start off by following up on what Woody said, essentially, and you also said, Steve, which is that the system in which we live is pervasive at all levels, meaning it would be surprising if we were not racist in a system that is inherently racist, meaning it's set up socioeconomically in a given way. It's also classist and misogynistic. I mean, the homophobic. I mean, there's so many ways in which the system itself needs to be challenged. And by that, I mean that we need to be, that it's a very active process that needs to happen for us, for a systemic racism to be opposed and for interpersonal racism to be also not incurred. And so it's not something that happens by a mere change of attitudes, even though changing attitudes is incredibly hard. It goes much beyond that. It means taking active steps in the systemic sense to look at institutional practices, to look at barriers that we may not even be aware are barriers. And that necessarily involves inclusion of people who have been left out by the system into the process of change. One obvious way of inclusion is by, including the affected parties on a racial, ethnic, or gender, or sexual orientation, or whatever kind of way. You want to include the people who've been most affected in the process of decision making, of revealing the difficulties, and so on. And in psychiatry, one aspect that we often don't take into account is that at the systemic institutional level is that means including in the process of review and decision making the voices of people with lived experience, so that it's also our patients essentially who are in a position to let us know where we still have a long ways to go. I mean, we have so much work to do, in a sense, that we can do it at all sorts of levels and still try to make an impact. Finally, I'll just say that at the interpersonal level, luckily, implicit bias seems to be malleable, seems to be something that can be changed. So there are people who are actively working on developing training methods, approaches that can have a person become aware of their implicit biases and then challenge them. Typically, there are, for example, there are tests, there are measures that you can take for assessing your implicit bias that are pretty good, and for which there's a substantial amount of research on meta-analyses, literature reviews, and so on. So I would urge people to become informed about those. And once you're aware of your blind spots, if you will, and they're blind for a reason, I mean, even with best intentions, they can be blind, then you need a system where those are systematically trained out of you by all sorts of methods. You could have feedback, supervision across the domains where you have particular difficulty. It's all can be uncomfortable, but it can also be very liberating, because we all carry this weight of racism on our shoulders, some groups more than others, but everybody's affected. And it would be excellent if we, as a set of institutions, devoted our attentions to it. For example, the APA, both APAs, the psychiatric and the psychological there is attention being paid, but both professional organizations, as well as many others, could pay even more attention to it than we've done so far.
Great. Thanks, Roberto. What are the other thoughts as we wind this up?
I really like what I'm hearing. A couple thoughts. The notion of challenging the way we become comfortable in the way we're thinking. So, for example, this present period, probably going back to the spring, is the most I've ever talked about racism in my career, even though I have been studying and reading about racism since the early 70s. So one of the things, and so I can choose to either be optimistic or cynical about this present conversation. Part of me says, when I read people telling me racism is bad for our health, part of me says, really? What took you so long to figure that out? But the larger part of me says, great. I'm glad we're coming to this collective realization. Now we have an opportunity to do something about it. So, for example, the fact that the three of us are actually sitting here trying to have a conversation about something that is difficult to talk about is progress. So that's number one. When you have these conversations, we're going to challenge each other. We're civil, we know each other, but it is very challenging because we're not always going to disagree with everything. So that's why I think this notion of challenging ourselves to think more broadly and to be more open about the possibilities of how we are engaged in a racist system, number one. Do I, as an individual, have any blind spots? And Roberto's right, there are things that we can do to try to look at that and challenge ourselves to think differently. That's all very, very good stuff. But we can't forget that eventually we have to circle back to confront the structure, the power relationships. So who is at the decision-making table? And that's where we do have to make sure that different constituencies, different groups of color or socioeconomic position have to be not in an advisory role, but in an executive role in these institutions so that things can indeed change. So Roberto's right. It's not only about changing my personal attitude. It's partially about that, but not exclusively.
Great. Well, gentlemen, that very, very insightful and challenging comments, I think, for all of us to think about. I, again, thank you both for talking with me and each other today. I hope that people who've tuned into this conversation have found it useful, interesting, and challenging for you as we start as a society struggle and ultimately conquer our racist past. So again, thank you, and thank you for turning in to listen to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.